So, hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. So, my name is Carlos Petzold, like he introduced, and I work as a statistician at RTI International. Today, I'm going to be presenting on an internal initiative to move our workflow on a specific project from SAS to R. So, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about our company. So, RTI International is an independent nonprofit research institute. Um, It was founded nearly 70 years ago in 1958 with joint funding from local businesses and the three main universities in the Triangle area. And I mentioned 1958 specifically because it was actually founded a year before the Research Triangle Park was founded, which was a nice, interesting tidbit that I learned while doing this presentation. So I work in the Center for Official Statistics, where our work is primarily made up of research contracts for nationally representative surveys. And I work as a junior statistician on a variety of these projects. So a little bit of background information about our project while still maintaining some privacy. This switch was done on a public health survey that collects information on various health topics with multiple rounds of data collection each year. We receive the survey data from two independent data collection centers that conduct web and phone-based interviews, and then we combine those two into one data set. Our programs consisted of data quality checks, data editing and weighting, and then we produced public and restricted use data files, online web tables, and a data dashboard. So we proposed to upper management that we could test out the logistics of rewriting our code to gain some valuable insights for our team and the rest of the company, specifically to get a gauge of the timeline for a full project transition for ours and other projects. Getting exposure to open source programming for staff that didn't have that experience already. Our team was made up of about 12 statisticians. Some had, already, learned R. That was their main programming language. Some had a combination of R and SAS experience, and there were some programmers that had never used R before and were kind of just new to R and RStudio, but not new to programming completely. And it also gave us an idea of how realistic this transition would be for other projects, bigger and smaller. Maybe they had some legacy code or they were a smaller project. We were a smaller project, so that's why we kind of pitched it to them that we wouldn't have to be rewriting years and years of code. One thing to note in particular is that this wasn't done like as a part of the project. It was done as an internal initiative, so it wasn't funded by the client that we were working with. It was funded internally. So our staff had to continue as normal with their duties on other client projects, similar to the structure of like a consulting firm. This is just to provide some context for our timeline, because if you work for a private company, you may be able to do a transition like this at a bit of a faster pace. So if you're still not sold on R on the third day of this conference, there were many reasons why we specifically switched to R, but then also more broadly why someone might want to switch to open source. So the open source tools are already much cheaper than paid software, but we also recently had received notice that if we wanted to renew our SAS license, the price was going to increase. So it encouraged all of us to look for other software options for projects that we could potentially shift all our code from SAS to R to see if it was could be completed in a reasonable amount of time. R and Python were, obviously the first two that came to mind, and we ended up going with R just because we had people that had experience with R and not as much with Python. We also noticed that similar to us, the clients that we would submit proposals to were also seeking the work to be completed with open source resources just because it was cheaper for them as well as us. R also serves as a more flexible programming tool than SAS due to having packages that you can create, and you're less reliant on one single corporation. So even if there's not a package out there that has exactly what you need, you're able to write functions or create your own packages to do the work. We also noticed new grads had more experience with open source programming experience, even in an area like here where SAS is really heavily incorporated in the curriculum. So we wanted to kind of align the work that we're doing with what students are learning in universities. So here's a quick diagram of our workflow. So after we receive the two data sets, we do our data quality checks on each one, just to make sure that the data is logical and consistent. As denoted by the yellow star, we were able to fully transition these programs from SAS to R. Um, it was a little bit tricky to convert just because there was lots of SAS macros and arrays that we would use, which we found to be trickier to transition than some of the other programs. Um, and then next we would do our data editing, which mainly consisted of harmonizing the two data sets that we got from the two independent collection centers. Um, we weren't able to fully transition these programs just because we wanted to dedicate our time to some of the more like dense and complex programs, whereas the data editing was just a lot of like recodes, like several hundreds of lines of recodes. So we focused our efforts on the data quality checks, weighting and estimation, and then some of our outputs like the data files in the codebook. So weighting and estimation was the next part of the process where we applied the weights and produced our benchmark estimates from the survey data. There was a mix of experience required to convert these, with the estimation programs being more straightforward, and our newer users were able to kind of do those relatively easily. But the weighting programs were more advanced, so we left those for the more experienced programmers. So after finalizing those weights and our estimates, we create our two data files, public and restricted use data files. We create our codebook and then our survey description document. Most of these were pretty straightforward, but we did notice that there weren't any public packages available that could do exactly what we needed for our codebook, because it was a very detailed kind of codebook for all the variables and everything that was going on. And the public packages that we saw were just kind of they would only say like maybe variable name, variable labels, and then value labels. So we just needed stuff that was more detailed than that. And so lastly, we would produce a data dashboard and web tables that give insights about the data that the client requested. Similar to the data editing programs, we weren't able to convert all of them just because, similar to data editing, it was kind of just a lot of code, but not super complex. So for our transition strategy, we had to take into account the timeline that we were given. We had about 3 months, October of last year through like mid-January of this year. And each employee was allotted about 30 to 40 hours to work on this. We tried to maximize our time by completing what we could in between our survey rounds so that we weren't having to actually complete our work while converting everything and validating that it was all correct. So as a general timeline, the first month was dedicated to training staff if they needed training. The second month was for actually converting the code, and then the third month was for like doing code reviews and the quality assurance between the two outputs. So our team had varying levels of R experience. As I said, some were R as their main language, and then others, they're familiar with programming, but they had never really used R or RStudio at work or in any context. So we delegated programs based on how experienced the team members were with R. More experienced users were able to jump right into the complex programs, while the beginner users had to start with, trainings, maybe just like very basic introductions using like data camp courses or things like that. So each team member had the option to register for a data camp license, which is just an online learning platform that offers courses and trainings for R and RStudio and other languages as well. This wasn't a requirement, and some didn't register, but it was offered as a resource for training. We also set up weekly team meetings to discuss the training resources that were provided, and then in the second month discuss how much progress had been made, and then the third month just to kind of do code reviews and quality assurance sort of all together as a group. And in addition to these weekly meetings, we would set up one-on-one and group training sessions on more of an as-needed basis to deal with issues that came up in the day-to-day. So for our validation and quality assurance, to make sure that our R code was producing the same results as our SAS programs, we used a combination of 3 approaches. We would do side-by-side comparisons of program output, manual spot checking of maybe specific estimates or specific records, and then we would do code reviews with a more experienced programmer and a beginner user kind of walking through together the work that they were converting. So the side-by-side comparisons, we would look at the summary tables, final estimates, and any of the other final deliverables just to confirm that they matched the SAS versions that we had already submitted. We also implemented manual spot checking, where we would trace maybe an individual case or specific variables through both the SAS and R workflows to ensure that the recodes were applied correctly, missing values were the same, um, and that maybe if we were applying like a formatting, that it was all coming out the exact same way that we had been doing it before. Our more experienced programmers would then do code reviews with the beginner users as part of the assurance process. So our more experienced programmers were reviewing the work of the newer users to ensure accuracy, not only of the end results, but that the logic and the flow of the code that they were writing kind of match what we had been doing before. So actually, during one of these checks, we caught a sneaky issue related to text encoding in the R package that we used to import SAS datasets, which is called the Haven package. So there were two rows in the data that were partially corrupted during the import, but there was no warning, there was no error, nothing even told us that this had happened. So it was just important to make sure that we were doing our quality assurance and review not only kind of on the end results, but that we were doing it with the input and at the very beginning as well. So there was a lot of good that came out of this pilot initiative, but a few things did fall a little bit short of our expectations and weren't quite what we expected. First, the online courses that we assigned, like Data Camp, turned out to be a little bit too generic for the people that use the online trainings. They did teach the syntax and did a really good job introducing users to maybe specific packages, but not necessarily exactly what we needed. And a lot of the things they were learning, they said that they didn't actually apply to the work that they were doing, so they didn't find it too useful. Secondly, we could have, at least for our team specifically, our scheduling could have been a little bit tighter from the start. So we assumed that people would have time to carve out to transition programs. But like I mentioned earlier, since we're kind of like a consulting firm, staff had to kind of carve out time of their other work to focus on this training, and we just kind of assumed that they'd be able to do that. But it was more difficult than we expected for people to carve out the time. So third, many new users hit roadblocks before they even wrote a single line of code. Things like installing R and RStudio. How do I like even import a data set? How do I start an R session? Kind of all these different things, learning the RStudio interface. And so we didn't actually give like a guided intro setup session to all that. And that would have been really useful, probably would have saved us a decent amount of time. And lastly, we kind of took a ask if you need help approach, which wasn't super effective because when we did the opt-in meetings, people wouldn't really attend that much or as much as we kind of wanted them to. So we realized it was much more effective to build in kind of mandatory check-ins that people had to kind of cancel or decline the meeting rather than accepting it. So there were a few things that stood out as super effective for us, specifically the paired programming and the small group project-specific trainings. For our paired programming, we matched experienced R users with newer ones that gave us hands-on learning in real time with real data. It was more efficient than formal training like Data Camp, and it gave people to ask kind of live questions to the person they were working with instead of, if you're using Data Camp, you kind of just have to look it up on the internet or use ChatGPT or something like that. Small group sessions were also a hit. We used our own data when we would do these small group sessions, just kind of walking through the programs. We'd have kind of an experienced user leading with the beginner users all attending, and they would kind of walk through their thought process of, how am I going to convert all this code? Am I going to go line by line? Am I going to kind of refactor everything? Just kind of based on each program that we had to do. And while they weren't perfect, as we all know, AI tools and Stack Exchange were really helpful at the very beginning for newer programmers if you want to kind of brainstorm and bounce ideas back and forth for maybe how do I convert a specific line of code, or how do I do this specific thing in SAS, maybe a procedure or something that you might do in a data step. How do I translate that exactly into R? It's also important to, if people haven't used AI tools before, just make sure that they're aware of the privacy concerns, don't put any sensitive data in there, and that it can also be wrong, as we know. So the best thing that kind of came out of this is that most of our new users, people that came in with maybe they were familiar with R but had never used it before at work, they were able to work independently at the end of the 3 months, which we found was great. It was awesome. So, in terms of the impact, this was only a pilot project to see the benefits and downsides of the transition. But there's a large potential if we decided to do it on other projects and maybe company wide. Um, the main benefit would be, like I said before, the long term cost savings for both us as a company and the clients that we submit proposals to. Um, we'd no longer have to pay for the SaaS software, SaaS licensing, and we wouldn't have to put we'd have to put less people through SaaS trainings. Um, this wouldn't necessarily be something we could do completely because some clients do specifically request that we use SaaS when doing the work for them. So as a product of implementing these open source tools, we now have employees. It was about 4 or 5 employees that had never used R before, and so now they have a new programming language in their toolkit that improved their existing and improve their existing skills if they were a more experienced user. Um, Another good thing that came out of it is that, like I mentioned, we couldn't find a public codebook package that had exactly what we wanted to do. So 2 of our employees created an internal R codebook package that now other people use in the company if they're using R and maybe they need a very detailed codebook. So that was something that we didn't expect initially that turned out to be really beneficial. So another good thing that came out of it is now we have an actual idea of what challenges and good outcomes might come from transitioning just maybe on a single project to see if it's feasible for other projects to do it or if we want to do something more company-wide on a large scale. And so a few takeaways if maybe your team is doing something similar, you're trying to train new people, implement a new language, and specifically if your team has beginners, you should start with the absolute basics before touching any code. This includes things like a basic introduction to packages, how to install and load them into a session, and explaining small differences between R and whichever language you were using before. In our case of SaaS to R, there were small things like case sensitivity and the differences between different R files that you can use, R Markdown or an R script, that weren't made super clear, and there was kind of just little things that would add up that kind of wasted time that we would prefer to have actually rewriting code. Another important tool we found helpful was to schedule the recurring meetings with people of all different levels of experience there at the same time. This was really well received by our newer R users, so they could ask questions in real time and they weren't kind of stuck independently. They had more experienced users there to help answer their questions. So we also found training to be the most effective when it was put in the context of the real work, using real data and not just kind of independent walking through a training where it tells you, I want you to use this package to do this, like in many cases was on the data cam training lessons. And then lastly, encourage your staff to use AI tools, but like I said before, they can be wrong, they can hallucinate. So just make sure they're aware that AI, that they can be wrong, and to kind of double check with other resources, other online tools, or with other programmers to make sure that you're not just kind of taking its word for it. And then here was a little example of a ChatGPT interaction that circulated on social media a few months ago, where you asked how many R's are in the word strawberry, and it said 2. So this was a kind of a good example to illustrate that can be wrong with simple things and just give you completely wrong information. So we started this initiative with the challenge of rising costs and limited resources, but we ended with a team that's more confident and capable in using R, even with beginner users, and now we're on the path for a full conversion. So that's it. Thank you.